The teacup was upright. That was the first thing Miss Jane Marple noticed when she stepped into the vicarage kitchen on that cold Tuesday morning in October. Not the body, though Mrs. Dorothea Fenn lay on the stone floor with the particular stillness of someone who would never move again. Not the open window letting in the smell of dying roses. Not the Reverend Edmund Fenn crouched beside his wife, holding her hand and saying her name in the soft, broken way of a man who already knows the answer but cannot stop asking the question. The teacup, white porcelain with a blue cornflower pattern, sitting precisely on its saucer at the kitchen table. No tea pooled beneath it. No chair knocked back. No biscuit dropped and forgotten. Everything arranged with the quiet, unconscious tidiness of a woman who had simply stepped away for a moment and intended to return. Except Dorothea Fenn had not stepped away. She had fallen. And people who fall, people who clutch their chests and feel the sudden catastrophic failure of their own hearts, do not, as a rule, set their teacups down first. Miss Marple stood in the doorway for exactly 4 seconds, long enough to see what everyone else in that kitchen had already decided not to notice. Then she pulled her cardigan a little tighter, shifted her knitting bag on her arm, and said nothing at all. Because in Miss Marple's considerable experience, the moment you said something was the moment people stopped showing you things. And there was a great deal more to see. Chapter 1. A Death Too Neat. St. Mary Mead had its own particular way of absorbing tragedy. First came the gathering, the quiet accumulation of neighbours on pavements and garden paths, drawn by some instinct older than curiosity, the ancient human pull toward the place where something terrible had happened. Then the murmuring, which was not gossip, not exactly, but rather the village processing grief aloud, trading details the way other communities traded currency. And then, eventually, the conclusions reached collectively, with the comfortable certainty of people who had known each other long enough to believe they knew everything. By 9 o'clock on that Tuesday morning, St. Mary Mead had already concluded that Mrs. Dorothea Fenn had died of heart failure. By 9:30, 3 separate women had mentioned to 3 separate neighbours that Mrs. Fenn had not looked at all well at the Harvest Festival last month. By 10, it had been established without any medical authority whatsoever that it had only been a matter of time. Miss Marple heard all of this on her walk from Danemead to the vicarage, absorbing it with the mild, interested expression that people perpetually mistook for the comfortable incomprehension of an elderly lady. She had not, in fact, been invited to the vicarage. She rarely was in situations like this. She simply went. Years of experience had taught her that in moments of shock, a familiar face carrying a familiar tin of homemade shortbread was admitted without question into places where official inquiries were not. And she had known Dorothea Fenn for 11 years, had sat beside her at the Women's Institute, had admired her sweet peas at the summer fete, had accepted her particular brand of practical kindness more times than she could count. She had liked Dorothea Fenn. That mattered to her more than she would have said to anyone. The vicarage was a square Georgian building set back from the lane behind an old stone wall, its garden running to seed in the pleasant, haphazard manner of places tended by people who love growing things but cannot quite keep pace with them. The gate stood open. 2 police constables stood in the front garden with the slightly lost air of men waiting to be told what to do next. Mrs. Clara Price from the post office was already stationed at the corner, her expression a careful composition of distress and acute attention. Miss Marple nodded to the constables and walked in. The kitchen was at the back of the house, and reached through a narrow hallway that smelled of beeswax and old books. By the time Miss Marple arrived in the doorway, the body had been moved, laid on a makeshift arrangement of coats and cushions by the far wall, while someone telephoned for the doctor and someone else made tea, because in England the response to death and the response to distress are, practically speaking, identical. Inspector Graves stood in the centre of the room with his notebook open, looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a man who has already written his conclusion and is now merely gathering confirmation. He was a tall, flat-faced man of about 50, is with the particular brand of confidence that Miss Marple had always found most dangerous in an official. The confidence of someone who has been right enough times to stop questioning whether he might be wrong. Reverend Edmund Fenn sat at the kitchen table. He was a slight man, perhaps 62 or 63, with thin silver hair and the gentle, slightly bewildered face of someone who had spent 40 years believing in the fundamental goodness of people, and had just received this morning the most devastating argument against his position. He was holding a mug of tea that someone had placed in his hands, and staring at it as though he could not remember what it was for. Miss Marple set her shortbread tin on the counter, quietly, unobtrusively, in the manner of someone who belongs somewhere, and looked around the kitchen. It was a pleasant room, low-ceilinged and warm, with copper pots along one wall and a dresser crowded with the cheerful clutter of 11 years of parish life. Photographs from confirmations and harvest suppers, hand-drawn cards from Sunday school children, a small ceramic hen that served no particular purpose except to have been there long enough to become invisible. Dorothea Fenn had made this room, in the way that certain women make rooms, not by designing them, but by living in them so completely that the room takes the shape of the person. The teacup was still on the table. Miss Marple looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the dresser, where the cups were kept, lined up in their pairs with the particular precision of a woman who noticed when things were out of place. One cup on the table, one saucer, one spoon, laid neatly across the saucer's edge. And on the third shelf of the dresser, a gap, the space where a second cup should have been, and wasn't. She counted the remaining cups without appearing to count them. 11. The set was a service for 12. Someone had tea with Mrs. Fenn this morning, Miss Marple thought, with the calm precision of someone arranging facts rather than feeling them. And when they left, they washed their cup and put it away, and they were careful enough about it to make sure the spoon was dried as well. She moved to the window, looking out at the garden. The foxgloves along the far wall were magnificent. Tall and heavy-headed, just past their peak, their purple bells beginning to darken and curl at the edges. Miss Marple. Inspector Graves had noticed her. His tone suggested he found her presence neither surprising nor welcome. "I wasn't aware you had been called." "I hadn't," she said pleasantly. "I came to pay my respects. Poor dear Dorothea. Such a dreadful shock." "It appears to have been heart failure," the inspector said, with the briskness of a man closing a drawer. "Dr. Pemberton is on his way. Perfectly straightforward, I'm afraid. A woman her age, the strain of parish life." 58, said Miss Marple mildly. Graves blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Mrs. Fenn was 58. I attended her birthday luncheon in April. She was in excellent health, walked 3 miles every morning, and grew her own vegetables." She smiled at him with perfect gentleness. "Though I'm sure you're right, Inspector. These things are often quite sudden." She said it in the tone that meant the opposite. Graves looked at her with the expression she was very familiar with, the expression that was not quite dismissal and not quite attention, but somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. Then he turned back to his notebook. Miss Marple moved to the Reverend's side and sat down across from him. Up close, his face was worse, grey, slack, the face of a man who had not yet managed to make the grief real. "Edmund," she said very quietly. He looked up. Something in his eyes sharpened slightly, the way eyes do when they recognize someone real in the midst of shock. "Jane," he said, "she's gone. I know." She did not reach for any of the usual consolations. She simply let the fact sit between them, acknowledging it without dressing it up. Then, after a moment, "Tell me, when did you find her?" 7:30. I'd been in the church since 6, early prayers, and then I had correspondence to see to." He stopped, swallowed. She was always up before me. There was always tea made. I came back at 7:30, and she was on the floor, and the tea—" He gestured vaguely at the table. "The tea was still warm." Miss Marple nodded. "Was anyone here when you came back? Anyone in the lane or the garden?" No, I don't think so." He frowned, the first flicker of something beyond grief. "I thought I heard the garden gate, but I assumed it was the milk." "The milk comes to the front," said Miss Marple. He stared at her. "The garden gate is at the side," she continued pleasantly, as though commenting on the weather. "The milkman always goes to the front. You've mentioned it before. He leaves it on the top step." She paused. "Edmund, she told you she was frightened. You mentioned it to Mrs. Price in the lane. I heard her asking you." The change in his face was subtle, but significant. A deepening, a shame. "Last week," he said, she said something was troubling her, something she'd seen or heard. She wasn't clear. I told her she was worrying unnecessarily. I told her." He stopped. The mug in his hands trembled almost imperceptibly. "I didn't listen, Jane. I should have listened." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. She looked at the teacup on the table. She looked at the gap on the dresser shelf. She looked at the foxgloves through the window, standing tall and dark in the October morning. "You couldn't have known," she said at last. Which was true, but she also knew, with the quiet, careful certainty that had guided her through 40 years of observing human nature, that someone had known. Someone had walked into this kitchen this morning, drunk tea with Dorothea Fenn, watched her begin to die, and then washed up before they left. That someone was frightened too. Frightened people made mistakes. She just had to be patient enough to find them. Dr. Pemberton arrived at 11, a stout, red-faced man of perhaps 65, who moved through the vicarage kitchen with the particular authority of someone who had been the local physician long enough to believe the village had no medical secrets from him. He examined Mrs. Fenn with the brisk efficiency of a man fulfilling a formality, exchanged a murmured word with Inspector Graves. Ian signed the death certificate with a fountain pen he produced from his breast pocket. Heart failure. Natural causes. Miss Marple watched him from near the dresser. She watched the way he did not hesitate, the way he did not look at the teacup, the way his eyes met Inspector Graves's with the brief, confirming glance of two men who have reached the same conclusion by different routes, and are satisfied to find each other there. She watched him pocket his pen and cross to the window, looking out at the foxgloves with an expression that was professionally neutral. and personally something else entirely. She filed all of it away. On her way out, she paused in the kitchen doorway and looked back at the room, at the upright teacup, at the gap on the shelf, at the Reverend Edmund Fenn sitting at his kitchen table with his cold mug of tea, staring at the space where his wife had been. "Careful, people," she murmured to herself, so quietly that no one heard her. "A frightened people." She pulled her cardigan straight and walked out into the October morning. Chapter 2. The village knows everything except the truth. There are certain advantages to being an elderly woman in a small village, and Miss Marple had spent the better part of 8 decades making precise and unsentimental use of every one of them. Chief among these was the Wednesday Knitting Circle. It met in Miss Marple's sitting room at 2 o'clock, had met there with the reliable regularity of tides for 11 years, and it was attended by 4 women who between them knew, conservatively speaking, everything that happened in St. Mary Mead. Not because they were gossips, though they were certainly that, but because each of them occupied a different position in the village's social architecture, which meant that information which would never travel between 2 of them directly passed through the circle with the effortless ease of water finding its level. Mrs. Bantry sat in the wing-backed chair nearest the fireplace as she always did, her knitting needles working at a steady, comfortable pace on a very long scarf she had been making for 3 winters. She was a large, warm-hearted woman with a sharp mind she preferred to conceal beneath a manner of cheerful vagueness, and Miss Marple trusted her judgment more than almost anyone's. Miss Evelyn Weatherby, younger sister of the postmistress, which made her effectively the second terminal of the village's information network, occupied the left end of the sofa, her needles moving with the nervous speed of a woman who knits the way others pace. Mrs. Hilda Jarvis, wife of the churchwarden, sat beside her. She had known Dorothea Fenn as well as any of them, and her eyes were still red. And Mrs. Price herself, Mrs. Clara Price of the post office, who had been standing at the corner of the vicarage lane that morning, and had spent the intervening hours collating every fragment of information the village had produced, sat in the upright chair by the window with the expression of a woman who has been waiting all day for a suitable audience. Miss Marple poured tea and offered seed cake, and let the conversation find its own shape. "She was never right. That's what I said to my husband," said Mrs. Jarvis, into the first gap. "Not since the summer. Something was weighing on her. You could see it." "Heart failure," said Mrs. Price, with the authority of someone who had heard it from a constable. "Dr. Pemberton was very clear." "Dr. Pemberton," said Mrs. Bantry, in the tone of someone filing a careful reservation, "has been very clear about a great many things over the years, some of which turned out to be considerably less straightforward than he supposed." A small silence, in which everyone agreed without saying so. "What I cannot understand," said Miss Weatherby, her needles clicking, "is the matter of the will." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with the mild, interested expression of someone hearing something new. She was not hearing something new. Mrs. Price had mentioned the will on the vicarage lane that morning, in a half-sentence that she had clearly been waiting to complete. "What will is that?" she asked. Mrs. Price set down her teacup with the slight forward movement of a woman preparing to deliver. "Mrs. Fenn changed her will 3 weeks ago, went to Blackwood and Associates in Barchester, didn't use Mr. Jennings in the village, which tells you something, and made changes that, according to Alice, who does for the Jennings, and who happened to overhear Mrs. Jennings telling Mr. Jennings, were quite significant." "Significant how?" asked Mrs. Bantry. "She cut out her sister." Mrs. Price paused to allow this to land with its full weight. Eleanor Vane, completely removed. The room was briefly quiet. Miss Marple had known about Eleanor Vane in the abstract, the estranged sister, a presence on the edge of village knowledge without ever quite entering it. She had met her perhaps twice, be at events connected with the church. A composed woman, contained in the manner of a person accustomed to keeping a great deal inside a small space. "Do they know why?" she asked. "No one does," said Mrs. Price. "That's just it. They'd been civil enough, not close, not since their mother died, and there was that business with the estate, but civil. And then 3 weeks ago, without a word to anyone, Mrs. Fenn drives herself to Barchester and comes back with a new will, and doesn't say a thing about it to the Reverend." "How do you know she didn't tell him?" asked Miss Marple. "Because I asked him," said Mrs. Price simply, in the tone of someone who sees no reason not to. "This morning, when I spoke to him in the lane, he looked entirely blank, Jane. He didn't know." Miss Marple absorbed this. A woman who changed her will in secret, told her husband she was frightened, and was found dead 3 weeks later. The sequence was not comfortable. "There's something else," said Miss Weatherby, her voice dropping slightly, though they were entirely alone. "The organist, Mr. Ashby, Cyril Ashby, the young man who came in September." "What about him?" asked Mrs. Bantry. "He was seen leaving the vicarage yesterday morning by Mrs. Holland, who lives on the lane and who was taking in her milk at 7:30 and saw him coming out of the side gate." Miss Weatherby's needles had slowed without her appearing to notice. "The side gate, not the front." The side gate, where Reverend Fenn had heard the latch, and assumed it was the milk. "He's a pleasant enough young man," said Mrs. Jarvis doubtfully. "Very musical. Mrs. Fenn seemed fond of him." "When did he come to street?" "Mary Mead?" asked Miss Marple. "September," said Miss Weatherby. "Beginning of September. Answered the advertisement for the organist position. He'd been in London before, I think, or somewhere north. He doesn't talk much about himself." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her needles maintaining their steady rhythm. A young man who appeared in September, 2 months before Mrs. Fenn's death, who was seen leaving the vicarage by the side gate on the morning she died. "The strangest thing, though," said Mrs. Price, who clearly had more, "is Eleanor Vane. She arrived in the village last Saturday, 4 days before her sister died." She met Miss Marple's gaze across the teapot. "She said she came on impulse, to see Dorothea, to try to repair things, she said." "And did she see her?" asked Miss Marple. "She says not. She says Dorothea wouldn't meet with her. She says she left a note and received no reply, and spent the weekend at the Goose and Crown. And then Monday came, and she was going to try once more. And instead, her sister was dead." A careful story, Miss Marple thought, detailed in the right places and vague in others. The sort of story that had been constructed rather than remembered. Was Mrs. Fenn a woman who left her teacups unwashed? Miss Marple asked. The question fell into the conversation like a stone into still water. Everyone looked at her. "What an odd thing to ask," said Mrs. Bantry, though she was smiling slightly, because she knew Miss Marple well enough to know the question was not odd at all. "Was she?" Miss Marple asked again pleasantly. "Lord, no," said Mrs. Jarvis, with the certainty of someone who had spent years in the woman's kitchen at church committee meetings. "She was particular about that, above almost anything. She once made me wash a cup twice, because I'd set it on the draining rack without properly rinsing the inside. Firm about it, Everything in its place. Everything in its place, Miss Marple repeated softly. She said nothing more on the subject. The conversation moved, as conversations in knitting circles do, through several other matters: the flower rota, the harvest festival accounts, Mrs. Price's daughter's new situation in Bristol, before arriving back, as it inevitably would, at the morning's events. It was Miss Weatherby who provided the final piece, as she was buttoning her coat to leave. "I nearly forgot. Eleanor Vane was at the post office this morning, sending a telegram," she paused, "to London. I couldn't see the address, but I saw the first line quite clearly because she didn't turn the form away when I came to the counter." "What did it say?" asked Mrs. Bantry. "It said, 'It is done. Do not contact me here.'" After they had gone, Miss Marple sat alone in her sitting room for a long moment, her knitting in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance. Then she put on her coat, took her walking stick, and went to the vicarage garden. She found it in the far border, the foxgloves tall and late flowering against the stone wall, most of them intact. But one stem, approximately halfway along, was broken. Not broken at the base, which would suggest wind or careless feet, but broken perhaps 18 inches up, where a hand had gripped and twisted and taken what it wanted, and the break was fresh. The green was still vivid at the wound. Miss Marple looked at it for a long moment. Then she took her handkerchief from her pocket, wrapped it carefully around the broken stem, and placed it in her knitting bag. She walked home in the failing afternoon light, thinking about a woman who had changed her will in secret, about a young man who left by the side gate, about a sister who sent a telegram that said, "It is done," and about a teacup that had been washed and put away so carefully that someone had even remembered to dry the spoon. Chapter 3. The Sister's Smile. Eleanor Vane was staying in room 4 at the Goose and Crown, which was the better of the village's 2 rooms for letting, and which looked out, if you craned slightly, towards the church tower. Miss Marple had ascertained this through the simple method of asking Mrs. Bantry, who had ascertained it through a method Miss Marple preferred not to examine too carefully. She went the following morning, carrying her best strawberry preserves, 2 jars, because 1 was a gift and 2 was a conversation. Eleanor Vane answered the door herself. She was a handsome woman, 54 or 55, with the kind of dark, composed features that age well, and the kind of stillness that can look like dignity, or can look like something else entirely, depending on what you know. She wore a grey dress that was slightly too formal for a morning in a village inn, as though she had dressed for an occasion rather than a day. Her eyes, when she saw Miss Marple, registered something that was not quite surprise, and people who are not quite surprised have been expecting something. They are just not certain what form it will take. "Miss Marple," she said, "how kind!" "I hope I'm not intruding," said Miss Marple with perfect warmth. "I knew your sister, and I wanted to offer my condolences in person. These are from my garden." She held out the preserves. "I know it's a small thing." Eleanor looked at the jars for a half-second longer than necessary. Then she stepped back. "Please come in." The room was small but comfortable, with a window seat and a writing desk, and a chair by the fire that someone, Eleanor presumably, had pulled to face the door. The instinct of a person who prefers to see what's coming. On the mantelpiece, among the inn's generic decoration, one personal item had appeared: a framed photograph propped against the clock. Miss Marple settled into the offered chair, and arranged her expression into the gentle, slightly vague sympathy appropriate to a condolence call. "Such a terrible shock," she said, For all of us, but most of all for you. To have come all this way. Yes, said Eleanor. I came last weekend, hoping to speak with her. Her voice was steady, almost too steady. The voice of a woman who has been rehearsing composure. She wouldn't see me. We had disagreed some time ago. I thought perhaps enough time had passed. A pause so finely calibrated it almost sounded like grief. And now it's too late. Families are difficult, said Miss Marple with feeling. These things accumulate. Often we think there is more time than there is. Eleanor looked at her. Yes, exactly. It must be a comfort, Miss Marple continued, and with the gentle persistence of someone following a harmless thought, that you were here, whatever the circumstances, that you made the effort, even if she, well. She let the sentence trail with gentle sympathy. I suppose so. Miss Marple let a small silence fall, and looked about the room with the pleasant, incurious gaze of a woman taking in her surroundings. Her eyes reached the photograph on the mantelpiece and rested there. 3 women, arms linked, standing in front of a garden gate. The photograph was old, 40 years perhaps, but recognizable nonetheless. The woman on the left was a young Dorothea, laughing at something. The woman in the middle was a young Eleanor, not laughing, but with the nearest expression to happiness that Miss Marple suspected Eleanor Vane had ever worn. And the woman on the right, younger than either of them, perhaps 20, dark-haired and bright-faced, was someone she had not yet placed. What a lovely photograph, said Miss Marple. Is that you? You were very handsome. A long time ago, said Eleanor. And the other woman, the young one on the right, not Dorothea, a friend? A pause, just slightly too long. A cousin, said Eleanor. She died young. It was a long time ago. She picked up the photograph, turned it face down on the mantelpiece, and changed the subject with a fluency that was almost impressive. Will you take some tea? I can ask Mrs. Holland to bring some up. Miss Marple accepted graciously and looked about the room, while Eleanor spoke to the door for a moment. The writing desk held a small stack of papers, face down. The wastebasket had been emptied recently, and the window curtains were open, but the window latch was drawn across. The instincts of a person who expects to be observed. There was a pair of gardening gloves on the window seat. Miss Marple looked at them, then looked at the window, which gave onto a narrow gravel path between the inn and a stone wall. No garden, no earth. The gloves were not new. They had been used, substantially used, the leather creased and dark at the fingers, but there was nothing for them to be used for, here, unless Eleanor had brought them from somewhere else, unless she had used them before she came. You've been very brave, Miss Marple said when Eleanor returned. Managing all of this on your own. You have no family nearby. My nephew is in the village, actually, said Eleanor, and something shifted in her eyes, a tightening, and as though she had said something she had not intended to. He came a couple of months ago. He's taken a position here. I hadn't mentioned it because it isn't relevant. Her nephew, in the village, since September. Miss Marple's needles, which she had produced from her bag, maintained their steady rhythm. Her expression remained perfectly, serenely pleasant. Inside, something she would not have called excitement, because she was far too old and far too honest for excitement, but which was perhaps the deep satisfaction of a pattern resolving, moved through her with the certainty of a key finding a lock. How nice for you, she said, to have family nearby. What does he do? He's a musician, said Eleanor, in a tone that was trying to be casual. The organist at the church. Miss Marple looked at her with eyes that were, in that moment, approximately as gentle and comprehending and dangerous as anything in St. Mary Mead. "How very convenient," she said softly, "for him to have found a position here." Eleanor met her gaze. For just a moment, a fraction of a moment, the composure cracked. Not much, just enough. The look of a woman who has just realized, with cold precision, exactly how much the old lady sitting across from her with her knitting actually sees. Then the composure returned. Perfect, seamless. "Yes," said Eleanor. "Wasn't it?" Miss Marple left the Goose and Crown an hour later with 2 pieces of new knowledge, one confirmed theory, and a sense of the whole architecture of the thing that made her walk slightly more slowly than usual, because she was thinking very hard about what it meant. She was halfway back along the lane when she saw Cyril Ashby. He was coming from the direction of the Goose and Crown, from the back, from the alley behind the inn, the way a person comes when they do not wish to be seen entering or leaving. He was 28, or perhaps 29, fair-haired and pale-faced. And at the moment Miss Marple saw him, he was very pale indeed. The kind of pale that has nothing to do with cold. He walked with his hands in his coat pockets, and his head slightly down. The movement of someone holding themselves together with some effort. Miss Marple said nothing. She simply adjusted her course slightly and nodded pleasantly as he passed. He looked up and met her eyes. What she saw there was not guilt. It was something worse. It was fear, and beneath the fear, the particular expression of someone who knows something terrible and does not know what to do with it. "Good morning, Mr. Ashby," she said. "Morning," he said, and walked on quickly. Miss Marple watched him go. Then she turned and looked back at the inn, at room 4's window, where the curtains had moved slightly, the way curtains move when someone has been standing close to the glass and has stepped back. She went home and sat in her chair and opened her notebook to a fresh page. She wrote 3 words in the centre of it. Then she drew a line from each word to the others, until the page looked like the plan of something, a structure or a trap. Then she underlined one name 3 times, Eleanor Vane. Chapter 4. Poison in Small Doses. Doctor! Miss Pemberton's surgery occupied the ground floor of a Victorian terrace on the north side of the village, and it smelled, as it always had, of antiseptic and old carpet and the particular staleness of a room where anxious people had been waiting for many years. Miss Marple arrived at 10 o'clock the following morning, which was the quiet hour between the end of morning appointments and the beginning of whatever unexpected difficulties the afternoon would bring. She told the receptionist she needed to renew her prescription for her rheumatism. This was true as it happened, which she found professionally convenient. Dr. Pemberton saw her in 12 minutes, which was a record. He was a stout, florid man who had the manner of someone accustomed to being the authority in any room he occupied, and he settled behind his desk with the comfortable weight of a man at home, and listened to Miss Marple's description of her rheumatism with the attentive patience of someone who has been doing this for 35 years and has learned to make it look like interest. She described her symptoms at some length. She mentioned the cold mornings. She mentioned her late friend, Mrs. Fenn, who had always said that the damp from the garden was the worst of it. She mentioned, with the soft, sidelong sympathy of a woman growing old in a community of other people growing old, how dreadful it must be for Dr. Pemberton, losing a patient so unexpectedly. "Though I suppose," she said with a mild frown of recollection, "at Mrs. Fenn's age, one is never entirely surprised. I always thought she pushed herself too hard." Doctor. Pemberton nodded and produced his prescription pad. Heart can be unpredictable. These things happen, I'm afraid. Of course, and she had been having some symptoms, hadn't she? I seem to recall, or perhaps I'm mistaken, she mentioned feeling unwell, dizziness, something of that sort. A slight hesitation. The prescription pad paused. She came in, he said, choosing his words with the careful deliberation of a man selecting among several and rejecting the ones that would lead somewhere. About a week before, some complaints of dizziness and palpitations, she thought. These things can sometimes be the precursor to a cardiac event. And you treated her? I advised her to rest, reduce her activities. He met Miss Marple's gaze. She'd never been my patient previously, you understand. Kept herself to herself, health-wise. A remarkably self-sufficient woman. Never been his patient previously. The GP who had known this woman for 11 years, who lived in this village, who had signed her death certificate, and she had never been his patient. She had come in 1 week before she died for the first time, because something had begun happening to her body that she didn't understand, something that felt like her heart. She must have trusted you, though, said Miss Marple gently, to come to you rather than going to Barchester. She must have thought you were the right person. Something crossed his face that she could not quite read, something that was not guilt, but was in the same territory, the same landscape, a knowledge, an unease. I hope I served her well, he said, and wrote the prescription with a slightly heavier hand than necessary. Miss Marple thanked him and left. She went directly to the village library, which was housed in what had once been the old schoolroom, and was now presided over by a young woman named Patricia Holt, who was 26 and possessed of the rare combination of genuine curiosity and very good organizational instincts. Miss Marple had, some years ago, made it a point to become Patricia Holt's most appreciative reader, and the investment had paid dividends on several occasions. Patricia was waiting for her. I found what you were looking for, she said without preamble, in the soft voice of a librarian who has learned to pitch everything for the ears of one person. She led Miss Marple to the reference table at the back, away from the 2 other patrons. On the table was a folded piece of paper with several handwritten notes, and beneath it, a printed page from what appeared to be an old newspaper archive, accessed via the library's modest subscription to a historical record service. The woman in the photograph, said Miss Marple. The third woman. Ruth Vane, said Patricia. Eleanor Vane's niece, her brother's daughter. She married a man named Ashby, 1989. Ruth Ashby, née Vane. She touched the newspaper page. She died in 2021, 3 years ago. The inquest returned a verdict of accidental death. She paused. She was the mother of Cyril Ashby. Miss Marple sat very still. Cyril Ashby is Eleanor Vane's great-nephew, she said. Yes. And he was placed in this village 2 months ago, specifically to... She stopped herself. She looked at the notes Patricia had made. Eleanor Vane had a small private income, but the bulk of the family money, what remained of their mother's estate, had gone to Dorothea Fenn upon their mother's death, because Dorothea was the elder, and their mother had been traditional in her arrangements. Eleanor had contested this, years ago, unsuccessfully. Since then she had subsisted on a smaller inheritance and on the understanding, an old understanding, implied rather than written, that when Dorothea died, the money would come to Eleanor. And then Dorothea had changed her will, 3 weeks ago, removing Eleanor entirely. And the new will, Miss Marple remembered from Mrs. Price's account, had been scheduled for final signing on Friday. Mrs. Fenn had died on Thursday. "The timing," said Miss Marple softly. To herself, to no one in particular. But Patricia Holt nodded, because she had worked it out too. "Oh, she was being poisoned," Miss Marple said. "Not a theory. A conclusion. Over weeks. Foxglove extract, digitalis, in small quantities, administered during friendly visits, producing symptoms that looked like a developing heart condition, establishing a history of cardiac complaints." She paused, and then, when the window was closing, when the will was about to be signed, and Eleanor would lose everything, the final dose, in the morning tea. The shape of it was whole now, complete, assembled from all its pieces. The second teacup, washed and returned. The foxglove stem, freshly broken. The gardening gloves with no garden. Dr. Pemberton's evasiveness, a man who had seen the symptoms, perhaps even suspected, but had said nothing because Eleanor Vane was an old acquaintance, because it was simpler, is because he was not certain enough to act and certain enough not to ask. "What are you going to do?" asked Patricia. Miss Marple looked at the notes, looked at the newspaper page with Ruth Ashby's name, thought of a young man, pale and frightened, walking out of an alley with his hands in his pockets and his head down. "I need to speak with Cyril Ashby," she said. Chapter 5. What the Organist Heard. He came to her door that evening at 9 o'clock, which told her several things. He had spent the day deciding. He had walked back and forth between his lodgings and her cottage gate at least once, probably twice, before finally coming in. And he had come in the dark, which told her he was frightened enough of being seen that he had waited for it. She had left the lamp on in the front window. She had known since the morning that he would come. She opened the door before he knocked. He stood on her doorstep looking, if possible, paler than he had in the lane, his fair hair damp from the evening air, his eyes the eyes of someone who has not slept, and is beginning to understand that sleep is not the primary problem. "Come in," she said, and stood aside. She put him in the chair by the fire with a cup of tea that she had already made, because tea in Miss Marple's experience was not about comfort, but about the hands having something to do, which in moments of confession was quite as important. Then she sat across from him and waited. He talked for a long time. She did not interrupt. He had been approached by Eleanor Vane 18 months ago. He had known her slightly. She was his mother's aunt, a distant and somewhat formal presence in his childhood. But she had sought him out specifically, had tracked him down through a mutual acquaintance, and had presented what she described as a family matter. His great-aunt, Mrs. Dorothea Fenn, was elderly and increasingly isolated. She needed someone young and capable near her. Eleanor had arranged the position at St. Mary Mead as a natural way for him to establish himself there. His job was simple: befriend Mrs. Fenn, be pleasant, be present, report back on her health, her activities, her visitors. She said it was because she was worried about Dorothea, he said. She said she wanted to know she was all right. "But you came to doubt that," said Miss Marple. Yes, eventually." He looked at the fire. "Mrs. Fenn was kind to me, really kind. Not, she didn't have to be. I was just the new organist. But she invited me to tea, and she asked about my mother, and He stopped. "She was a good woman. I knew she was a good woman, and I was reporting on her movements to someone who hated her. And I didn't know then what Eleanor was going to do. I didn't know." "When did you begin to suspect?" He was quiet for a moment. October, 4 weeks ago. Mrs. Fenn started looking unwell. I'd seen her every week for tea after choir practice. And suddenly she was pale, and her hands shook, and she said she'd been dizzy. I thought it was just age, illness, but then I mentioned it to Eleanor, and Eleanor—" He paused. Eleanor looked satisfied. That's the only word. She looked satisfied, and then she made her face into the correct expression. But I'd seen it. And you did nothing. It was not an accusation. It was simply a fact stated gently, and he received it as such. I didn't know for certain, he said. I told myself I didn't know. He looked up at her. Which isn't the same thing. No, she agreed, it isn't. The night before Mrs. Fenn died, I heard Eleanor on the telephone. In the corridor of the Goose and Crown, late. I'd gone downstairs for water, and she was in the alcove by the stairs with the house phone, and I heard her say, very clearly, it has to be tomorrow. The new will is being signed Friday. Miss Marple's needles did not pause. And then I knew, he said. Then I was certain. And I went to the vicarage the next morning, early, as soon as I could, before 7, to tell Mrs. Fenn, to tell her what I knew, and what Eleanor was. He stopped. His voice had altered, become something smaller and more broken. She was already on the floor. She was already, I think she was still warm, and I didn't know what to do. I panicked. I left. The teacup, said Miss Marple. The second teacup, the one that was washed. Did you? Eleanor had told me. His voice was very low now. Weeks ago, before I knew what she was planning, before I put it together, she said if I ever arrived and found Mrs. Fenn in any distress, any kind of health emergency, I should not make a fuss. I should call for help and make sure any cups or glasses were washed before the fuss began, because Dorothea was very particular about her kitchen, and wouldn't want people to think she'd been untidy in a crisis. He looked up at Miss Marple with the expression of someone who has spent days unpacking what they were told. I thought it was an eccentric instruction at the time. I just filed it away. You washed it, said Miss Marple. I washed it. He put his head in his hands. I didn't understand what I was washing away. Miss Marple looked at him for a long moment. A young man who had been used as a tool by someone far colder and more purposeful than he was equipped to recognize, who had failed at a crucial moment to act on what he knew, who had washed a cup that he had not understood was evidence. Following instructions he had not understood were preparation for murder. He was not innocent. But his guilt was the ordinary or terrible guilt of someone who looked away from something uncomfortable and found afterward that it had cost more than he had imagined looking could cost. You are going to go to Inspector Graves, said Miss Marple, tonight, and you are going to tell him everything you have told me. He looked up. They'll say I was involved. They may, she agreed, but you weren't, and the truth, in my experience, tends eventually to make itself understood. Eventually. She reached into her knitting bag and produced her handkerchief, the foxglove stem still carefully wrapped inside it. You will give him this as well. Tell him where I found it and when. He took it from her carefully, as though it were fragile. And Cyril, she said as he rose to leave, when you speak to him, and you must be direct, not cautious. I direct, you will ask him to speak to the solicitors at Blackwood and Associates. There will have been a record of Mrs. Fenn's new will. The timing of her death, relative to the signing appointment, is a fact that Inspector Graves will find it very difficult to dismiss. He nodded. He was steadier now. Not better, precisely, but oriented, given a direction in which to move. At the door he paused. She asked me once, Mrs. Fenn, at one of our teas, whether I believed in second chances. I said I thought most people deserved them. He looked at the doorstep. She said she wasn't sure. She said she thought some people spent their whole lives looking for them and forgot to simply live. He went out into the dark. Miss Marple closed the door and stood for a moment in her hallway. Then she went to the window. In the distance, beyond the village rooftops, she could just see the Goose and Crown, a warm rectangle of light in the darkening October evening. In room 4, the curtains were closed. "The net is closing," Miss Marple said to herself very quietly. "She knows it too." She went to bed, but she did not sleep for some time. She lay in the dark and thought about Eleanor Vane dressing in grey for occasions, about gardening gloves with no garden, about the way a woman who had waited 11 years for money that was already hers could find when it was threatened, a patience for planning that ordinary people would not recognize as dangerous until it was entirely too late, and about a sealed letter in a sewing basket that no one had yet thought to look for. Chapter 6. The Last Confession and the First Truth. She was at the police station before 8, and Inspector Graves was not there yet. Inspector Crane, his superior, was. He was a quieter man, compact and watchful, who had the manner of someone who had learned that the most useful thing a detective can do is be still long enough for other people to fill the silence. Miss Marple had worked with him on 2 previous occasions, and had found him, on balance, the most satisfactory sort of official. Not so clever that he needed to demonstrate it, and experienced enough to know the difference between interference and assistance. "Cyril Ashby came to see you last night," she said without preamble. "He did," said Inspector Crane, and gestured for her to sit. She sat. She placed her knitting bag in her lap. She told him everything, methodically, without drama, beginning with the teacup and ending with the foxglove stem, passing through the will, the gardening gloves, the photograph, Eleanor's telegram, Dr. Pemberton's evasiveness, and the prearranged instruction to wash the cup. She laid each piece down in order, the way she would lay cards on a table, and she watched him as she spoke with the same attention she had turned on everyone else in this investigation, noting what surprised him, what confirmed something he already suspected, and what hit him differently than he had expected. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The second teacup," he said, "Ashby admitted to washing it." Following Eleanor Vane's instructions, given in advance, under the guise of protecting Mrs. Fenn's dignity in a health emergency. He did not understand what he was doing. He understood it by the time he came to me. She paused. "You'll want the foxglove stem tested, and digitalis extraction leaves traces. And you'll want to look in Mrs. Fenn's sewing basket. There is, I believe, a sealed letter there that no one has yet examined." He looked at her. "How do you know about a letter?" "Because Dorothea Fenn was a woman who noticed things and kept them to herself until she was certain. She was frightened. She told her husband so, and she would have, when she became certain, written it down. She wouldn't have sent it, not without more evidence, but she would have written it." Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting bag. "She was that kind of woman, careful, thorough, rather like the person who killed her, except for entirely opposite reasons." Inspector Crane sent 2 constables to the Goose and Crown. They found Eleanor Vane coming downstairs with her bag packed at 9:15, and she had booked a taxi to the Barchester station. She was composed, absolutely composed, and she said nothing when they told her she was required to accompany them. She pulled on her coat with perfect steadiness and walked to the police car as though she were going somewhere she had always known she would eventually have to go. She said nothing, not one word. Miss Marple sent a note to Reverend Edmund Fenn that afternoon, asking if she might call. He opened the door himself. The house had a different quality now, already settling into the particular silence of a place where one person has been and is not any more, and showed her into the sitting room. There were others there. Mrs. Bantry, who had come in the quiet way she did when she sensed that someone needed another person simply to occupy space. Young Cyril Ashby is standing near the window with the expression of a man who is not certain he has the right to be present but cannot make himself leave. Inspector Crane, who had driven out at Miss Marple's indirect suggestion that the Reverend ought to hear the shape of things from someone who would tell him gently. They sat down. Inspector Crane, at Miss Marple's quiet nod, opened his notebook. "I want to explain what we believe happened," he said to the Reverend. "Miss Marple will help me. I think you deserve to understand it properly." And so it was told, the whole of it, from Eleanor's grievance and the money that had never quite reached her, to the long preparation. Cyril placed in the village to report, the slow administration of digitalis extract over weeks, to establish a pattern of cardiac symptoms, the arrangement with Dr. Pemberton, not a conspiracy, exactly, but a history of personal connection exploited, and a man who had chosen, at the critical moment, not to look too carefully. The final dose, administered that last Tuesday morning over a cup of tea. The pre-planned clean-up, the telegram. Reverend Fenn listened to all of it in complete stillness. His face changed in ways that were very difficult to watch, the grief already present taking new and more specific shapes as understanding arrived. He was not a man given to expressions of anger, and anger was not what arrived. Something older and quieter came instead, the expression of a man confronting the precise shape of his own failure at a specific, irrevocable moment. "She told me she was frightened," he said. As he had said to Miss Marple in the kitchen, but with a different weight now. Not confusion, recognition. A week before, she came to me in the study and she said, "Edmund, I think something is wrong." And I said, he stopped. I told her she was overwrought. I told her she was doing too much, and her imagination was... He stopped again. "You couldn't have known," said Mrs. Bantry, firmly and kindly. "No," he said, "but I didn't try to." He looked at his hands. "If I had listened, she would have had difficulty proving it," said Miss Marple, gently but clearly, because comfort in this case was not the same as honesty. And the Reverend deserved honesty. Even with your full attention, with everything she could have told you at that point, which was not much, only a fear, only a feeling, it would have been very difficult to act in time. Eleanor Vane was very careful. "She was in our home," he said. "She came to tea here. In October, 3 weeks before—" He couldn't finish. "Yes," said Miss Marple. She did not soften it. Inspector Crane set a folded piece of paper on the table. "We found this in Mrs. Fenn's sewing basket," he said, "inside a small tin, at the bottom, beneath her embroidery threads. It's addressed to you. We've read it. We had to, for the investigation, and with your permission, it will be evidence, but it's yours." The Reverend looked at the folded paper for a long moment. Then he reached out and took it with both hands. He read it in silence. The room was very quiet. The fire, the distant sound of a blackbird from the garden, the soft sound of Mrs. Bantry's needles, which she had produced from somewhere without anyone noticing, and begun to work because knitting in a quiet room was sometimes simply what one did. And when he finished, he set the letter on his knee and looked up at the window. "She says she loves the garden," he said. "She says she has been worrying about something she isn't certain of. And she is writing it down because, she says, she has always trusted words more than silence." He paused. "She says she thinks Eleanor means her harm. She says she cannot prove it, and she isn't going to alarm me, until she is certain. She says she will know soon, one way or the other." He stopped speaking. After a moment, "She signed it your Dorothea, who is sorry for being cautious. That was always how she signed her letters, since before we were married." No one spoke for a while. Miss Marple looked at Cyril Ashby by the window. He was looking at the floor with the expression of someone carrying something very heavy that he has accepted he will be carrying for a considerable time. It was not the worst expression a person could wear. She had seen worse. The expressions of people who refused the weight entirely, who set it down and walked away and called it pragmatism. He would carry his, and it would not destroy him, though it would change the shape of him. People could survive being changed. Mrs. Fenn left instructions with her solicitor, Inspector Crane said gently, after a suitable interval. "The new will. Her estate goes to the Church Restoration Fund, and," he glanced at his notes, "a bequest to the Royal College of Music, and a smaller bequest to a young person in the village who she thought had a real gift." He looked up. "She named you Mr. Ashby." Cyril looked at him. Something in his face came undone, briefly, and then reformed, not the same as it had been, but something that might eventually become something better. "She knew," Miss Marple said, half to herself. "She knew, and she was not. She didn't let it make her cruel." Reverend Fenn folded the letter carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. "No," he said, "that was never her way." She stayed until the afternoon, until the inspector had gone, and Cyril Ashby had left quietly through the front gate, and Mrs. Bantry had made them all sandwiches, with the unarguable practicality of a woman who knows that people need to eat, even when they don't think they do. The Reverend walked Miss Marple to the garden gate when she finally rose to leave, and the October afternoon was turning gold at the edges, a low sun striking the garden wall, the roses still holding on past their season with the stubbornness of well-tended things. "She grew these herself," he said at the gate. He gestured at a cluster of late roses, deep pink, open-faced, slightly ragged with the season. "She said English roses were stubborn things. They bloomed when nobody expected it." Miss Marple looked at the roses for a moment. She thought of a woman who had noticed she was frightened and written it down in careful words and sealed it in a tin because she trusted words, who had left a bequest to a young man who had been used against her, because she had seen something in him worth supporting regardless, who had set her teacup down tidily on the saucer and died. "She was the kind of woman," said Miss Marple, "who noticed things, the right things. It's a great pity the wrong people noticed her first." She adjusted her cardigan, picked up her knitting bag, and walked home through the golden October afternoon. On her kitchen table that evening, she opened her notebook to the page where she had written 3 words and drawn the lines between them. She looked at the name she had underlined 3 times. Then she closed the notebook. In the village below, the church bell struck 6, steady and clear, the way it had struck every evening for 200 years. The foxgloves stood dark against the vicarage wall. The sewing basket sat on its shelf in the sitting room. The small tin returned to its place among the embroidery threads, and on the garden wall, because cats return when the thing they loved is gone, and something still remains of it. A small tabby appeared, and sat in the last of the evening sun, looking at nothing in particular, with the calm, absolute serenity of a creature that has no use for secrets. Miss Marple put the kettle on. Thank you for joining us at Marple Mysteries. If this story held you until the last line, leave a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from. We read every single one. Subscribe to stay with us. We'll be back soon with another tale from the village that tries it might, can never quite stay quiet.